Welcome, everyone, to this briefing brought to you by the Israel Defense and Security Forum, IDSF. In Hebrew, our name is Abitchonistim. IDSF is the leading Israeli organization advocating for strong national security-oriented policies to guide the state of Israel. Thank you to all of our viewers and supporters for tuning into this briefing. It's a pleasure to be joined today by Martin Sherman, who spent 7 years in operational capacities in the IDF. He's the founder of the Israel Institute for Strategic Studies, a member of the IDSF research team, and a participant in the Israel Victory Project. Martin, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for the invitation.
We have a very important issue to discuss, which is the state of Israel's public diplomacy. We, of course, know that this war in Israel is fought on many fronts. It's fought on the battlefield with the soldiers, and it's fought on the world stage with public diplomacy. And many people often question the extent to which Israel is putting forth its best foot in public diplomacy. So I'll let you speak a little bit before I pick your brain and ask you some questions. What is the state of Israel's public diplomacy?
Well, let me start with a quote that was written almost 20 years ago by Professor Eitan Gilbor in Bar-Ilan University. And he wrote about Israel's public diplomacy, and he said the following: the lack of an adequate public diplomacy program has significantly affected Israel's strategic outlook and its freedom of action. This could have applied today. Any further neglect of adequate public diplomacy would not only restrict Israel's strategic options, it would be detrimental to its ability to survive in an increasingly intolerant and hostile world, which thinks that sacrificing Israel's vital interests, or even the state itself, would be a small price to pay for ending the global confrontation between the West and Islamic fundamentalism. So he wrote that in 2006, which was almost 20 years ago. And I think it's true today. I don't think, if you look how embattled Israel is after suffering a horrific attack, you could just see how far it's on the back foot in the public diplomacy arena. And so I think this is something that Israel has badly misjudged and neglected. In fact, I think public diplomacy today, and for quite a few years, has been Israel's greatest strategic challenge, its gravest strategic failure, and perhaps its grimmest strategic danger. Because in many ways, I think that Israel hasn't grasped that public diplomacy is a lot like the Air Force. The traditional function of the Air Force is to generate freedom of action for the ground forces so that they can achieve their objectives. In the same way, in fact, perhaps even in a higher level, public diplomacy is there to generate freedom of action for Israel's strategic planners so that they can achieve their objectives. And we're seeing this now with Rafah, for instance. If Israel had a more powerful public diplomacy, I think people would understand that Rafah is a strategic interest for Israel. It has to be taken. And, despite the regrettable collateral damage that might be inflicted. So I think these words written 18 years ago are still very apt today. I think in many ways Israel has allowed the Palestinians to control the narrative, and we need to regain the narrative. We need, and the prime strategic aim should be to undermine and delegitimize the Palestinian narrative, which itself is basically a false narrative based on myths. It's based on the myth of Palestinian homeland. It's based on the myth of an authentic Palestinian nation. It's based on the myth of an authentic Palestinian people, and the difference between people and nation is one is a political entity and the other one is an ethnic entity. It's based on the myth of statelessness, and it's based on the myth of refugees. I can go through this. I don't know how much time we have, but I can go through these briefly. If you look at the original version of the Palestinian covenant, which was which was put together in 1963, before Israel held a square inch of what's now the so-called ancient homeland. They specifically, explicitly, not implied, explicitly eschew any claims to Judea and Samaria and Gaza as the ancient homeland. They say that belongs to Jordan and Egypt. All of a sudden, only when the Jews took it over, suddenly it became the ancient homeland. The same thing with the nation. The Palestinian figures who said that the Palestinian claim to nationhood is a mere hoax to pry the Jews' hold of Israel loose. The same thing with people. The peoplehood, they've claimed that they're part of the Arab people. They're not a distinct people on their own. None of this has been put on. Statelessness, for instance, and why the Palestinians have no citizenship? Not because of Israel. They were all Palestinians in Judea and Samaria were Jordanian citizens up until I think it was 1988, when King Hussein stripped them of their citizenship. So they have no citizenship, not because of Israel, but because of Jordan. And the same thing about refugees, which has now become center stage in the public debate now with UNRWA, because Palestinian refugees are not like any other refugees in the world. They have a special status. It's transferred paternally by inheritance from generation to generation. So from a few 100,000 in the end of the 1940s, it's ballooned into millions, 5-6 million. So all of these haven't been addressed by Israeli public diplomacy, and we basically, as soon as we accepted the fact that they are an authentic people nation who have an authentic claim to a homeland, we basically lost the we lost the battle, and it's going to be very tough to turn the wheel back, but it has to be done. I remember when I was younger and thinner, driving down Tel Aviv Beach, listening to a discussion in the Labour Party before the election. And the left wing of the Labour Party suggested that the Labour Party acknowledge Palestinian claims to statehood. And Shimon Peres went ballistic. He said, "Are you guys crazy? Only 2% of the population support that. We'll be decimated at the polls." But because the Palestinians and the Israeli left were resolute, because they were resourceful, and because they invested resources, they managed to take a narrative that was not only illegitimate, it was illegal. You could go to jail for talking to the Palestinians. In fact, Abi Natan did go to jail for setting up contacts with the PLO. And they turned it not into mainstream, but into the dominant narrative. Now, this has to be undone because, basically, if you want to conceptualize the conflict between us and the Arabs, you have a clash between two collectives who have mutually exclusive founding narratives, and it's a classic zero-sum game. What one side wins, the other side loses, and only one side can emerge victorious, and the other vanquished. And I think this is something that Israel must internalize.
Martin, it seems
it's rather bleak outlook, but I mean, I think we have to look reality in the eye.
It seems that Israel's public diplomacy is very fragmented. That you have the IDF spokesperson, you have the prime minister spokesperson, you have different spokespeople getting up on international media. What government agency is or should be in charge of public diplomacy?
Well, ideally it should be the foreign ministry, but because public diplomacy has never been considered a very important activity, it's been handed out to different minor ministries. There's a difference between, say, the IDF spokesman who comments on events, but I think Israel has misunderstood the whole issue of public diplomacy. It's not something that's event dependent. It should be something that is ongoing the whole time to create the context in which the events are interpreted. And let me give you an example. Take an event, for instance, a Palestinian boy who's accidentally killed by the IDF. It makes a great difference whether the context is that Israel is a valiant democracy fighting against a sea of tyranny and defending Western values of pluralism and religious freedom, etc., etc. Or on the other hand, if the boy was killed by an avaricistic land-grabbing fascist-like state who has little regard for non-Jewish lives, it's the same event, but the context is different. And I think Israel needs an ongoing effort to create the context, to regain the narrative, and show that we have indisputably the moral high ground.
Even within Israel, there are a multitude of opinions, and sometimes without that focused, one-stop shop public diplomacy office, voices within Israel speak out that are potentially harming Israel's national security. So I'm wondering how Israel creates a public diplomacy structure that is united to fight this war, as opposed to having all of these voices erupt that potentially could harm Israel's diplomacy.
Well, I think you raise a very valid point, and it's one that really concerns me and causes me a great deal of distress, I would say, because some of the people who are bad-mouthing Israel today are people I've known personally, and in some cases, my life was in their hands during my service, and I think in many ways, you're probably seeing the death throes of a certain kind of elite who will do basically anything, to burn down the club rather than hand over the keys. It's almost inconceivable that people with prime ministers, ministers of defense, heads of security services can advocate countries boycotting Israel because Israel wants to change how the judges are elected. It's mind-boggling. And we're, just before the 7th of October, we were descending into this dystopian reality where language was changing, where democracy actually was oligarchy, and patriotism and bad-mouthing Israel. It was a conflict that was changing basically the way language was used. And unfortunately, I think that you have people probably at the epicenter of this is Bibi Netanyahu. For some reason, gets people to lose their minds. They've tried everything to dislodge him, and they can't do it. And whether I'm not a critical apologist for Netanyahu. I have my own criticisms of him, but the rules of democracy. If you win at the polls, you win at the polls, and his opponents have tried everything, including crucially undermining Israel's public diplomacy efforts and painting Israel exactly in the way that Israel's gravest detractors want to do. This is like ripe fruit falling into their laps.
Now, some people would argue that Israel's public diplomacy efforts will always fall short because of the Jew hatred and global anti-Semitism. So what is your response to that? Do you think that with enough public diplomacy, Israel can curb the growth of anti-Semitism and the anti-Israel rhetoric, or there's always going to be this brick wall that can't be passed?
Well, I think that's an excuse rather than a reason. I think that there will always be some residual anti-Semitism. I grew up abroad, and I went to a Catholic school, and I was the only Jew in the rugby team. And there I learned one thing, that the non-Jews respect strong Jewishness, and they will respect a strong stance. And you saw this, by the way, in the 6 Day War. In the 6 Day War, Israel was was the object of admiration across the world. I don't know how old you were then, but I was old enough to understand what was going on. And in the 6 Day War, Israel was the darling of the world. Exactly the opposite happened during the Yom Kippur War, where there was a great erosion of Israel's image precisely because it didn't preempt. If it had preempted, the history of the Middle East would have been different, including the Arab oil embargo. So I think that look, anti-Semitism is probably the product of malice, envy, and ignorance. There's probably not a lot that you can do about the malice, and perhaps not much you can do about the envy, but you can do a lot to eliminate the ignorance. And I think if Israel was active and forceful and resolute on the public diplomacy, there would at least the third leg of anti-Semitism could be removed and make the whole thing far less stable.
Okay, so Martin, let me ask you, if you were running the newly created Israel's public diplomacy office and you had an unlimited budget, what type of messages would you put out there? Meaning, we have many viewers right now who are strong advocates of Israel or who are on board of promoting Israel. To what extent would you look at individual events and respond to them? Would you ignore individual events and look at big pictures? How would you do it?
I think first of all you can't ignore individual events, but you have to focus on the big picture. Your attitude to individual events has to be a derivative of your big picture, and I think you have to go on the offensive. You have to be unapologetic. I don't think it's enough to present Israel's achievements. With what Israel's being accused of, trying to point out that Israel's got scientific inventions and good restaurants and pretty women and nice beaches is a little like trying to ask for forgiveness because ask for forgiveness because of rape, arson, and robbery because you have a pretty wife, you like classical music, and you're good at science. At the moment, I think much of Israel's public diplomacy doesn't address the allegation, and I think the primary objective must be to undermine the Palestinian narrative, because all the delegitimization of Israel flows from the Palestinian narrative. And what you have to do is fight back and undermine the legitimacy of that narrative. Because once you do that, a lot of the criticism of Israel falls away. I've lost your voice.
Yeah, I'm back. I'm back. Martin, we are running out of time. I want to try to ask you one more question. We need to end our briefing a little bit early today. Something that I heard you say and something that our viewers point out often, the term Palestinian. Many of our viewers will point out in the world of public diplomacy, by using the terminology Palestinian, it by default gives legitimacy to Palestine. And I hear you use this word. So I'm wondering, how would you respond to that issue?
Well, I'm a little skeptical about how potent it is. I understand the claim. And normally, if the context is right, I always write Palestinian-Arab rather than Palestinian. But the point is, there's so many fronts. I'm not sure what the value is in opening up a semantic front now as well, because that's what people understand. That's terminology. So I understand the claim that this shouldn't be used, but until there's a widely accepted alternative phrase, the fact that I say Palestinian doesn't mean to say that I acknowledge his national demands. I mean, the Palestinian might be an ethnic group within the wider Arab entity, which, by the way, they themselves claim. So I'm not particularly obsessive about that. I understand it. I don't think it's nonsense, but I don't think it's on the front burner.
Okay, so one last question I have to ask in terms of wording for Judea and Samaria, the West Bank settlements. Should we be cautious about this language in our
I don't think
efforts
so.
at public diplomacy?
No, I think we should. I'm not, and I think we should insert it into the public debate so it becomes accepted non nomenclature. So it becomes an accepted term. I don't think we should shy away from that at all. I don't particularly think settlements is a pejorative word. We've allowed it to be smeared with negative connotations, but I don't think I sometimes use communities rather than settlements. I always use Judea and Samaria because I think that must be part of the debate. Uh, but again, I don't. Semantics is important, but substance is more important.
Martin Sherman, thank you so much for joining this briefing. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and your experience with us and all of our viewers. Very much appreciated. Thank you to all of our viewers and supporters for tuning in to this briefing. We will be back with you next week, still at 11 a.m. Eastern time until we change the clocks here in Israel the following week. And next week, we will be joined again by Brigadier General Amir Avivi. So for those of you who have been wondering where he is, you're going to see him next week on our briefings. Until then, stay safe, stay strong. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.